I'm delighted to welcome all of you to today's event, Gender in Contemporary Korean Poetry, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Nam-hee Lee. I teach modern Korean history and also direct the Center for Korean Studies at UCLA. And for those of you who may be new to our center's events, the Center for Korean Studies promotes Korean Studies program at UCLA and engages the UCLA community and the general public with various issues related to Korea and beyond by organizing lecture series, symposia, film screening, and cultural events. Please visit our website to learn more about our programs and events. And before I introduce today's participants, I'd like to also make a very brief announcement about upcoming events that the Center for Korean Studies is organizing. Over the years, a number of community activists and scholars have been working on curating and translating a set of documentary evidence concerning the Japanese imperial military comfort woman system into a readily accessible English format. And on May 20th, our center and UCI's law school and a number of other organizations would have a public event to discuss these resources in an effort to enhance ongoing discussions in the legal, scholarly, and educational communities in the US, South Korea, and the international community at large. So please be sure to check more information on that event on our website. Returning to today's event, it is the second of the series called Kwajォng, celebrating the process of translating Korean literature, which will be a bilingual reading of selected poems from Lee Soho's Catcalling and discussion of themes of gender in contemporary Korean literature by translator Soje and Professor Judy Han. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be made available on our center's website. And after speakers' presentations, there will be a time for Q&A. Please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. I also like to thank Hyung Kim, our Assistant Director of the Center, and Alex Chu, IT Technical Support Coordinator at the International Institute. And of course, I would like to extend my warmest thanks to both Soje and Judy Han, and of course also Victoria Cordell. This series was actually conceived and organized by Victoria Cordell, who's a second-year PhD student in Korean literature in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures at UCLA. So Victoria will be saying a few words about the series and also introduce Soje. My job is to introduce Professor Judy Han, who is a cultural geographer and assistant professor in gender studies at UCLA, where she teaches classes on gender and sexuality, Korean studies, mobilities or immobilities, and what does this say? Comics. Her research and publications cover a wide range of topics, including conservative religious formations, queer activisms, and protest cultures. I especially like to thank Professor Han for agreeing to be a discussant today, as she's been extremely busy with the series that she's been leading, the webinar series called Feminist Politics in Korea and the Korean Diaspora, which features invited guest speakers who are activists and filmmakers. And you should definitely check out these series. The information can be also found on the CKS website. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the microphone or the, I don't know what you call this, to Clark. Oh, Victoria, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Go ahead, Victoria.
Thank you, Professor Lee. This is, as just stated, our second event in the Kwajong celebrating the process of translating Korean literature series. And with the support of the Center for Korean Studies, Kwajong is seeking to bring to the forefront those dedicated individuals who bring works of Korean literature across into English and thereby enrich our field of study and provide materials that we can use in our undergraduate classes and share these fantastic and prescient works of literature with those who are not yet of the linguistic capability of reading them in their original Korean. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest translator, Soje. Soje and I first met and collaborated at a translation workshop held at UC Berkeley when they were still an undergrad. And their passion for Korean literature and their dedication to their craft has only increased exponentially since then and led to the publication of their first full-length translation, Hyemi's poetry collection, Unexpected Vanilla, in 2020. And April 2021 sees the publication of the topic of our discussion today, Lee Soho's Catcalling. And further in the future, in May, we'll see the publication of their first full-length novel, To the Warm Horizon by Choi Jin-young, as well. So a really busy year, an exciting year with really exciting works that are dealing with topics of gender and topics of sexuality that are, sorely missing from the extant translated works. Soje is not only a talented translator, but also works to broaden and deepen connections between translators, building community through their projects such as the translation zine Chokwa, which invites translators and those aspiring to translate to submit their own versions of one poem per quarterly issue in order to highlight the versatility of language and of translators' creativity. They're truly inspiring in their craft and their presence, and I'm so grateful they agreed to share their work here with us today. Thank you both.
Wow, thank you, Victoria. I didn't realize you were going to bring up my undergraduate days. But thank you for that very generous introduction and also for organizing this wonderful series highlighting translators of Korean literature. I'm a really big fan of the poet translators Kwajong and Sako Nakayasu, and I'm very honored to follow them in this event today. It's quite a jump that we'll be attempting between Isang and Lee Soho. And I'm going to share my screen now. Yes. Yeah, it's quite a jump, but there is a connection. Visual experimentation to express the subjective self beyond written language. I thought I'd take advantage of the particularities of a Zoom lecture and share my most visual translations of Iso's catcalling. I know the assignment is gender, and I'll get to that too, I promise. So, Isoho was born Lee Hyung-jin, Hyung-jin being her given name, in 1988. She studied creative writing at the Seoul Arts University, where she was taught by the poet Kim Hye-sun, among others, then went on to earn an MA in Korean literature from Dongguk University. She won the Newcomer Award in Modern Poetry in 2014 and the Kim Soo-young Literary Award for her debut collection Catcalling in 2018. And I want to clarify that she is a cishet woman, and I'm not dead naming her by acknowledging her birth name. Actually, Kyungjin, the semi-fictionalized version of Iso's past self, is the protagonist and one of the many speakers of catcalling, which exposes and ridicules the quotidian violences that Kyungjin experiences as she grows up and becomes an artist under patriarchy. The connection between form and content in this collection is palpable and persuasive. Isol blurs text to recreate the after effects of physical abuse, scatters verb conjugations into a collage, spells out the honorific yes with that very word repeated 400 sometimes, and recounts verbal abuse without spaces so that it takes up as little space as possible. And we'll be looking at some of those today. I know I just said I'll discuss the visual poems, but I thought I'd sort of ease us in, if that's even possible, with this collection, with the very first poem as a kind of curse aperitif. I say curse because it's very intense and an indication of the violence to come. 동거. 내가 태어났는데 어쩌다 너도 태어났다. 하나에서 둘. 우리는 비좁은 유모차에 구겨 앉는다. 우리는 같은 교복을, 남자를, 방을 쓴다. 언니, 의사 선생님이 나 하고 싶은 대로 하래. 그러니까 언니, 나 이제 너라고 부를래. 사랑하니까 너라고 부를래. 사실 너 같은 건 언니도 아니지. 동생은 식칼로 사과를 깎으면서 말한다. 마지막 사과니까 남기면 죽어. 동생은 나를 향해 식칼을 들고 사과를 깎는다. 바득바득 사과를 먹는다. 나는 동생의 팔목을 대신 그어준다. 넌 뱃속에 있을 때 무덤처럼 잠만 잤대. 한 번 더 동생의 팔목을 그었다. 자장자장. 넌 잘 때가 제일 예뻐. 동생을 뒤집어 놓고 재운다. 이불을 머리 끝까지 덮어주고 재운다. 비좁다 비좁다 밤이. 하나에서 둘. 하나에서 둘. Cohabitation. I was born, but somehow you were born too. From 1 to 2. We crumple ourselves into the cramped stroller. We use the same uniform, man, room. 언니, the doctor says I should do whatever I want. So 언니, I'm not going to call you 언니 anymore. Because I love you, I'm going to call you by your name. Let's be real. You don't deserve to be called a big sister, my little sister says, peeling the apple with a knife. It's the last apple, so you better finish it. Little sister points the knife at me as she peels the apple. Crunch, crunch. I eat the apple. I slit little sister's wrists for her. Mom says you slept inside her like it was your grave. I slit little sister's wrist again. Hush, little baby. You're prettiest when you sleep. I put her to sleep on her stomach. I put her to sleep, pulling the blanket to the top of her head. How cramped the night is. From 1 to 2. From 1 to 2. Thank you. And for this next poem, I'm going to be off screen for a little bit.
우리는 낯선 사람의 눈빛이 무서워 서로가 서로를. 언니야, 우리 둘이 살자. 엄마 아빠랑 전화도 하지 마. 가끔 죽는 신용은 정말 멋진 것 같아. 이리야 네가 나를 보잖아. 의사가 그러는데 폭력은 좋은 거래. 폭력은 내가 아프지 않다는 증거래. 봐. 무좀이 생겼어. 화가 분출되는 중이어서 이렇게 빨갛대. 나는 말이야. 언니가 종교를 믿었으면 좋겠어. 불평불만은 네가 좋아하는 그 신한테나 하는 게 좋겠어. 그러니까 영원히 시집가지 말고 이렇게 둘이 살자. 늙어 죽을 때까지 서로 의지하면서 살자. 다음 생에도 언니랑 자매로 태어나면 정말 좋겠지? 잊지 마. 너 같은 거 사랑하는 건 나밖에 없어. 우린 가족이잖아. 엊그제 내가 프라이팬으로 네 머리를 친 사랑하니까 그런 거야. 내가 얼마나 사랑하는지 이제 알겠지? 언니는 맞아요 말귀를 알아듣는 것 같아. 같이 살 수 없다면 같이 없어지는 게 좋겠어. 한날 한시에 죽자. 빨리 맹세 니네 신한테. 나랑 영원히 같이 살고 죽겠다고. 이게 생각할 일이야? 정말이지 언니는 신기해. 나를 기분 나쁘게 하는 재주가 있어. 애초에 대화라는 걸 할 줄 모르는 것 같아. 미안하다는 말 한마디로 모든 걸 떼어오려 하지 마. 어떻게 너 같은 대학에 갔는지 모르겠어. 이렇게 멍청한데 때려야만 말을 알아듣잖아. 개새끼처럼. 각주 2014년 11월 21일 시진에게 프라이팬으로 얻어맞은 날. 그때 일어난 가격으로 인해 잠시 글자가 두 개로 겹쳐 보이는 이상한 경험을 했다. Fearing the gaze of strangers, we each other. Hey big sis, let's live together, just the two of us. Don't even bother calling mom and dad. I think it's really cool to play dead sometimes. Because you only look at me when I resort to this. The doctor says violence is a good thing. Violence is proof that I'm not sick. Look at my body. The athlete's foot. The doctor says I'm this red because I'm letting out my anger. I want you to be religious. I want you to say all your moaning, groaning God you like. So let's never get married and live together, just the two of us. Let's lean on each other until we die. It'd be super great if we're sisters again in our next life, huh? Don't forget, I'm the only one who could ever love something like you. We're family. When I hit your head with the frying pan the other day, I did it because I love you. Now you know how much I love you, Onni. I think I have to hit you for you to understand what I'm saying. If we can't live together, I think we should disappear together. Let's die on the same day at the same time. Promise your God right now that you'll live and die with forever. Is this something you have to think about? Really, you're so weird. You have a knack for pissing me off. It's like you don't even know how to have a conversation. Don't try to patch everything up sorry. I don't know how you went to college. You're so stupid. I mean, I have to hit you for you to understand what I'm saying. Like a little bitch. Footnote: November 21st, 2014. The day Shijin beat me with a frying pan. As a result of those strikes, I had the strange experience of briefly seeing double.
Thank you. Could you hear me okay? Okay, great. I was getting a message in the chat about the volume, so just making sure. So this is the third poem in Catcalling, and the moment I saw this, I knew I wanted to translate it. I'm always looking for works that are exceptional in some way, works that can bring something new to the English language and literary scenes. Obviously, this accomplishes both. As you can see, I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor, but as you can see, there is a footnote in the Korean as well. Editors tend to be very anti-footnote when it comes to translations because they're seen as, pedantic and distracting. But most of the footnotes in Catcalling, I did not introduce into the text myself. I gave a reading on Open Letter Book's Instagram last week where I broke down my translation and editorializing of the footnotes in Shijin's Home, A House of Dead Stones. So I won't really get into the footnotes today unless someone has a specific question later. So there is a very obvious blurred effect on the page, and the footnote very kindly explicates the intent, which is the double vision or traumatic disorientation Kyungjin experienced from her younger sister's physical and verbal violence. As for my Kwajong, I made 2 text boxes on Microsoft Word and overlaid them and adjusted the opacity so that the text wouldn't become so bold. But I think the layout editor at Open Letter, Anthony Blake, might have done something a little bit different for the effect. Here I have an example where my approach looks quite different from his, and we can think about the many ways visuality can be translated and transmuted. On the left, we have the poem by Lee Soho. In the middle, the version that I turned in. And third, this is the final version that Anthony laid out. So I think part of the process involves the publisher's in-house style, including font and spacing. And had I known that Anthony, the marketing director, was also the layout person, I probably would have annoyed him a lot more with little tweaks. But this was a lesson for me too, in terms of realizing all the ways that translation becomes a collaboration through publication. At this point, I want to turn our attention to the word onni, which has already come up many times in these 2 poems. I've written an essay on onni called Not Exactly a Sister for Modern Poetry and Translation. The essay is much more nuanced than I'm going to be today, taking into consideration the historical evolution of the word, but in the interest of time and specific relevance to catcalling, I've summed it up into this sort of rudimentary chart. Onni, meaning older sister, is what a female person would call an older female person out of respect and a sense of familiarity. Oppa, meaning older brother, is female to older male. Nuna, meaning older sister, is male to older female. Hyung, meaning older brother, is male to older male. If you haven't caught on, age order is a huge deal in Korean culture. This explains why Kyungjin is and has to be 언니, or older sister, to Shijin. The honorific title is inextricable from their relationship. In an interview, Lee Soho said, "My sister and I are only a year apart, but the role and responsibilities vested by that single year are so different. Eldest daughters are pressured to be unconditionally patient. I wanted to speak about the unfairness of this." So you can start to understand the weight of this word as a symbol of power and responsibility and even violence. At the same time, non binary Koreans, such as myself, are excluded from this lexicon. Or is it an exclusion? Part of my realization of my identity came from the fact that I don't identify as either an 언니 or oppa. But because I worship at the nightclub of Munoz, I do sometimes wish that there were alternatives to call my queer Korean siblings and beloved and move away from anti-relationality. Like like nibbling, the gender neutral term for niece slash nephew, neologisms will be inevitably divisive. Some people will love it, some people will find it corny. So we'll see what kinds of new languages surface and stick around in Korean. Those with some engagement with K-pop will know that these four terms are also romantic and sexual terms. Despite or because of the incest taboo, it seems like lots of familial words are recycled into sex, like daddy, mamacita, and so forth. So it's not unique to Korean culture, but I find it interesting that the power dynamic is slightly less hierarchical than the parent-child relationship. I made a quick slide of some pieces of culture from the last 3 years or so containing the word 언니 in the title. This evidences the popularization of feminism as well as less mainstream lesbian narratives. Because 언니 simultaneously reveals the speaker and addressee to be female, it's a powerful word for sapphics and straight women seeking sisterhood alike. It's politically powerful and also convenient marketing wise to be able to signal in just one word that it's, quote, made by women for women. And living in Korea, I've been noticing cases of localization, which is the process of adapting certain products for the target culture involving 언니 as well. I wrote about my sister, the serial killer, being translated as 언니, I killed a man in my essay, and sort of the incongruence of the title and content. But what a title, right? And the next screenshot I have is about Ocean's 8 because the Korean media really rendered the cast of Ocean's 8 as 언니s to make them more familiar and approachable to the Korean female audience. These are some of the reviews and articles written on that movie. And one usage of 언니 even comes from Warner Brothers Korea, and it's about some hat giveaway. um, so maybe you get my sort of jadedness over this word. But nonetheless, I hope that it's clear why it's become such a go-to word for feminist culture. And now, after 언니, we have Oppa, who in the landscape of K-pop and K-dramas is a much more familiar figure. But you haven't seen Oppa like this unless you've been gaslit by a Korean man, which I dearly hope you have not been. The unnamed male speaker of Oppa likes that type of girl is indeed referring to himself in the third person, which is cringy as hell, regardless of how you feel about Oppa in general. But I wanted to highlight this poem because one, I appreciate the way Lee Soho's made his words take up less space in her poetry. And two, I might have used variations of sister in my translation had it not been for this Oppa poem. Because this Oppa doesn't translate to older brother in the biological sense, I decided to bring both Oppa and 언니 into my English translation. Again, I will cover my camera for this.
오빠는 그런 여자가 좋더라. 뭘 말하고 싶어? 아프면 죽이나 끓여 먹지. 왜 나한테 전화해?
나 이제 욕하는 것도 지쳐. 너 욕하고 싶은 거 참고 있는 거지. 그런 거지. 뭐가 두려워. 나는 내 모든 것을 나눠줬는데 넌 만족할 줄을 몰라. 이래서 난 우울한 여자는 싫어. 야, 징징 짜지 말고 똑바로 말해. 그리고 말하기 전에 다시 한번 생각 좀 해봐. 내가 이렇게 무식한 여자랑 사귀었었나? 너 똑똑하잖아. 그런 것이 아니잖아. 대화가 되잖아. 그러니까 뭘 아는 것처럼 행동하지 마. 오빠가 차근차근 알려줄게. 다 너 위한 거야. 야, 너 나 못 믿는 거야? 농담인데 왜 정색을 하고 그래? 전에도 말했지만 네가 기세고 예민해서 우리 연애까지 불행해진 거야. 다른 남자였으면 진작 헤어졌겠다. 이번에도 봐줬다 내가. 다음부터 그러지 마. 정 힘들면 술 마시고 잠이나 자. 너 그런 거 잘하잖아. 어차피 너 곧 풀릴 건데 지금 그냥 기분 좋게 끊으면 안 돼? 아까 너 입은 옷 못 봐주겠더라. 돈 생기면 옷이나 한 벌 사라. 보세 말고 브랜드 있는 걸로 나 안 쪽팔리게. 야, 나니까 이런 소리 하는 거야. 야, 나만한 남자 어디 가서 못 만나. 오빠는 변한 게 아니라 네가 변한 거야. 초반엔 꾸미는 척이라도 하더니 요즘엔 긴장도 안 하나 봐. 아무튼 난 바빠서 그래. 그것도 이해 못해? 일 없으면 취미를 가지던가. TV를 봐. 나만 쳐다보지 말고. 난 생산적인 여자가 좋더라. 오늘 뭐 했는지 알아서 뭐 하길 그만 좀 물어봐. 지금 의심하는 거야? 집착하는 것도 아니고 네가 이럴 때마다 미칠 것 같아. 이러니까 네가 그동안 남자들한테 차인 거 아니야? 나니까 지금까지 같이 사귀는 거야. 서운하게 생각하지 마. 연인 사이에 이런 말도 못해? 우린 이 세상 누구보다 제일 가까운 사이잖아. 너 생각하는 건 나뿐이야. 잊지 마. 그러니까 너 오빠한테 잘해. Oppa likes that type of girl. What are you trying to say? If you're feeling sick, go cook yourself porridge. Why call me? I'm sick of you. You want to cuss me out, huh? Go ahead. What are you afraid of? I gave you everything, but nothing satisfies you. This is why I don't like depressed girls. Hey, stop whining and talk straight. And think it over before you talk. Have I been dating a stupid girl? That's not it. You're smart. I can have a conversation with you. So don't act like you know something I don't. Oppa will explain everything to you one by one. I'm doing this all for you. Hey, you don't believe me? I'm just kidding. Why are you glaring like that? I've told you before, but it's because you're stubborn and sensitive that our romance turned sour. Any other man would have dumped you already. I'm letting you off the hook again. Don't do this again. If you're having such a hard time, drink yourself to sleep. You're good at that. You're gonna shake it off anyway. Can't we just hang up happy now? I couldn't stand to look at your outfit earlier. Buy yourself some clothes when you get paid. Not from an outlet mall, but something brand name so you won't fucking embarrass me. Hey, only I tell you this. You can't find another man like me anywhere. It's not that Oppa changed, you changed. You used to at least pretend to get dolled up, but I guess you don't even try these days. Anyway, I'm busy. Can't you understand that? If you don't have a job, why don't you get a hobby? Watch TV. Stop watching me. I like a woman who's productive. What are you going to do with what I did today? Stop asking me. Do you not trust me? You're so obsessed. I feel like I'm going to lose my mind every time you do this. This is why all those guys dumped you. Only I'd stay with you all this time. Don't take this the wrong way. You think lovers can't say stuff like this to each other? I'm closer to you than anyone else in the world. I'm the only one who thinks of you. Don't forget it. So be nice to your oppa.
Thank you. I can see Judy laughing. If you couldn't tell, that was 100% me reading with my voice pitched down in GarageBand. My plan was to sort of do a drag performance where I'm like lip syncing, but I sort of ran out of energy this week. So unfortunately I couldn't wow you with some drag makeup and whatnot, but maybe at a future reading I can accomplish that plan. I have one more poem to read. I want to check the chat. Okay. 전의를 위한 변주. 만지겠다. 만졌다가도. 만졌으면. 만져요. 만졌겠거나. 만지잖아. 만지겠는데. 만졌겠으면. 만졌겠다. 만졌으면서. 만지고. 만지다. 만졌네. 만지대. 만지려나. 만졌을까. 만졌겠거든. 만지지조차. 만졌던. 만졌어도. 만졌으리라. 만졌을지도. 만져서. 만졌어. 만졌겠어. 만지겠구나. 만지면서. 만지겠지만. 만질수록. 만졌어요. 만지니. 만지겠지. 만질수록. 만졌다면. 만져. 만지다가도 만졌더라. 만졌겠지만 만질까. 만졌겠고 만지겠다가도 만진답시고 만졌어야. 만지지. 만졌구나. 만졌지. 만졌으나 만졌고 만진다면 만지는데 만졌잖아. 만졌거나 만지거나 만지겠더라. 만졌겠네. 만졌으니까 만져야. 만졌다. 만졌으려나. 만지시네. 만졌더라면. 만졌더라도. 만지는. 만지더라. 만지겠더라도. 만졌거든. A musical variation for the fighting spirit. You would grab. Because you're grabbing. You will probably grab. Would you have grabbed? Will you grab? I'm not sure. You grab, I heard. To grab. You grab, yeah. Though you grabbed. You would have grabbed, or if you had grabbed, even when you grabbed, you grab. If you were to have grabbed, you must have grabbed. You're grabbing, huh? You're grab and you will grab, but you grab and yet you must have grabbed. You must have grabbed, yeah. Oh, you must have grabbed. If you had grabbed, while you would totally grab, while you're grabbing, not even grabbing, you who'd grabbed, you're totally gonna grab. You might have grabbed after all. Even if you'd grabbed, if you were to grab, you had to have grabbed. You're grabbed, but then again, sir, you grabbed me. Grab me. I know you had grabbed. Even if you'd grab, even while grabbing, you must have grabbed, but should you grab? You must have grabbed. Plus, in order to grab, you grab, I see. Would you have grabbed? Must have grabbed, yeah. You're grabbing, but you'll grab, huh? If you grab, if you were to grab, you grab, duh. Because you grabbed me. You grab. If you had grabbed. Even if you had grabbed. You grabbed, I'm telling you. You had to grab. You either grab or you grab and you grabbed her too. The more you grab, because you grabbed. You grabbed me. Because you grab. Yeah, you'd grab. You grab, but you grab or even if you were to grab. Yeah, you'd grab. You do grab. You did grab. You who grabs. Thank you. Um, I read this as another visual representation of the disorientation following a traumatic event. First, I know that the Korean verb is to touch, 만지다. I accepted my editor Anastasia's suggestion to change it to grab because A, it's somehow more violent, but also it also innocuous in the context of like grabbing lunch, grabbing drinks. B, I felt like touch could carry sort of a positive connotation in these COVID times. And C, I was translating when grabbing by the was still very much part of the national conversation. And so that verb was unfortunately resonant for me. And Korean has a bunch of conjugations based on tense, mood, and honorifics without specifying the subject or object. So you can imagine that there's no gender specified here either. It's entirely up to the reader whether it's a he or she or they or you grabbing me, you, him, her, or them. And understanding the heteronormative context Isol is writing from, I seriously considered him grabbing her, or more seriously, mixing all pronouns. But since I read it as a singular traumatic incident, I also like how the second person makes it more confrontational and implicates even the reader in the violent act. I added these extra words like yeah or duh because I needed to somehow come up with 72 discrete phrases, and I wanted to differentiate them in tone, similar to the way that honorifics do, but sort of in the opposite direction. In Korean, there's the formal hi, 만졌습니다, informal hi, 만졌어요, informal low, 만졌어, and plain form, 만졌다. And that's all without changing the tense. That's just the levels of formality. And speaking of honorifics, there is the formal yes, which is why I rendered it as yes, mom in relation to the title. I did consider yes, mom and dad, but it became very difficult to fit in one page. So sometimes translation choices really do come down to pragmatism in that way. And each book, presents a different set of challenges and thrills for the translator. And Catcalling was certainly a roller coaster to translate last year. I wish I could have read the chat while screen sharing, but I hope that you got a sense of all the twists and turns from my experience. And now I'm very excited to speak with Professor Han. Hello.
Hi,
Hi.
I think part of me is wondering if I'm even allowed to laugh at some of these both the poems in the original and the translations. But thank you so much. This has been such an amazing experience in immersing in the reading and now talking with you. I'm just so fascinated by your discussion of Ani and the language of queer kinship. So I actually really want to start there because I don't really care about just anything else. No, that's not true. But but gender pronouns in translation, like in such cishet, heteropatriarchal, binary gender context of Korea, Korean cultural customs, and the phenomenal interest in feminism in recent years, and of course the backlash. There is so much in both the politics and poetics of gender and sexuality and the names we call each other. This is such an interesting topic for Korean studies and translation studies. I think there's a lot we can do in queer theory to think through some of these issues in translation. But I wanted to actually ask you to say a little bit more about 언니 as a sexualized term. I know this is something that you wrote about a little bit in the essay that you mentioned, but it also comes up in this discussion too, in the idolizing of the 언니 figures in some of the ways that you've shown. There's also the idolizing and desiring I don't know if it's necessarily an older woman, but it is an older, yeah, it's both incestuous and sapphic, lesbianic, and also something other than that. There's something very Korean about this kind of same gender, identification / desire in familial terms. Can you say a little bit more about this? Because there's a lot of this in the poems too.
Yeah, for sure. In this context of catcalling, it is the 언니 figure is limited to the familial, right? The Shijin and Kyungjin are biological sisters, but then there's like sexualized violence happening between the mother and daughter, between the sisters. So it's sort of this complicated relationship that I don't know if Lee Soho intended us to read necessarily in a queer context, but she, I think, wanted to sort of heighten every form of violence possible between two human beings, for sure. As for 언니 as a figure of desire, what's funny is that every time I talk about this in an interview, it gets cut out for some reason. But,
really?
No, like what I'm about to say, which is the personal anecdote that I've never dated an older Korean person.
I see.
And I find this very relevant to my perspective, right? Like even before I, identified as non-binary, I never really had the chance to call anyone older to me, a woman older to me, 언니. And I wonder if that limits my sort of own propensity to see 언니 as a sexualized term. So
Oh,
when I bring up,
interesting.
bring up that thing, like somehow it always gets edited out in post. But I have talked to different friends who are, who do identify as cis lesbian or cis bisexual, and they do call their partners 언니, and because they're in a romantic and sexual relationship, that term also becomes sort of heightened erotically, I think.
Right. And which
Yeah.
I've always, I mean, you have your, history. I mean, I think I also find that to be very jarring, to imagine a romantic relationship where there would be someone calling the other 언니. But of course,
really?
Oppa happens, of course.
Yeah, Oppa happens. Daddy happens.
I mean, of course, right.
Right. Yeah.
But I think 언니 has held up, especially in a kind of a global sisterhood feminist context, where this isn't supposed to be about romantic alliances or romantic relationships, but really much more about shared rage against patriarchy. So there's something so subversive in opening that possibility with just even that use of the term in queer context.
Yeah, and the most prominent sort of I don't know if they would use this term necessarily, but lesbian and queer women inclusive organization in Korea is called 언니 네트워크, 언니 network.
Yeah,
so
long time.
So it's definitely used in both a political sisterhood context as well as
right.
like we call each other 언니 in bed kind of thing.
Right. Yes, I'm gonna have nightmares about this again.
Oh, no.
And of course among gay men too.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing about 언니 too, and the way that you're engaging in translation with this work is also that 언니 is the naming of relations within a family hierarchy. It's naming of one's location, simply by, just like in the examples that you've shown, just by calling someone 언니, you're also locating yourself in the hierarchy. So in many ways, it speaks to the heart of what's conventionally often, the biggest question in translating Korean to English, the subject, the I, all kinds of ways that 언니 actually helps name and locate the speaker. I mean, so all the different ways that you translated that location, whether through using the word 언니 capitalized or big sister, little sister, you. I mean, can you walk us through some of that dilemma? I mean, it must have been such a myriad like possibilities before you.
Yeah. I guess when I made the executive decision to introduce these Korean terms into the text, I then had many options, as you just pointed out. I had older sister, big sis, 언니, sort of these three things, and then I also had the name Kyungjin. So once I opened up myself to those possibilities, then I sort of had all these tools to experiment with rhythm. Like I would see, oh, like in this line or in this poem, it's better if I say big sis, or I try to think about how the word is presented in relation to the sentence. So if there's another sort of set of Korean words, place names, then maybe I would use sister instead of 언니 to sort of lessen the ratio of Korean words in a line.
Right.
So
yeah, in an English context I could also see that. Yeah, that makes sense. The other way that I think these hierarchies and gender politics and pronouns come into play is in the use of you. In the cohabitation, in the poem that you read too, just when the younger sister says, I won't call you 언니 anymore, you don't deserve that. Clearly that it's the kind of dynamic where 언니 is also seen as, you know, a qualification that actually one could be dispossessed of as well. So in places where like, I think it's actually probably most clear in, I'm looking at my notes, in cohabitation, but in other places too, where, I lost my place. Yeah, when you is used as the object, do you think that takes away from any nuance or ambiguity that exists in Korean, where the you remains unnamed?
In the case of cohabitation, because you just put it so beautifully, like it is a dispossessing of a title or sort of a ranking in relation, right, to the younger sister. I wanted to capture that in the tone of the sentence, right? Like, I'm not going to call it like, you don't deserve that, you know, to sort of I'm blanking on the word I want to use, but yeah, sort of use that tonally to show that this you is not just a simple you that it is in English.
Right.
And just because we don't use honorifics in English doesn't mean that we don't have all these hidden hierarchies and like, yeah, disparaging tones against each other.
Yeah, I mean, except, you know, in conversation, we usually have a chance to explain these things, right? I mean, I remember immigrating to the States when I was 12, and I remember the first day my younger brother and sister, because I'm the oldest sister, when my younger siblings used an English sentence and used the word you in, like, it was something like, probably like, why did you do that? And then it was like, you did you just call me you? I mean, it's this confrontation that that is so everyday in the English language, and yet in the Korean context, when the words are like no, 네가, it's not just you. How do you, I mean, how do you, what are some of,
we have 당신, which is the formal, extremely respectful version of that. So anything lower than 당신 becomes immediately sort of, it could be insulting, but also it could be a very familiar kind of thing, like, oh, we're really good friends, so I can call you you.
Right. So going back to the they pronoun, the gender pronoun, I know that you had referred to they in Korean, 제.
Yeah.
Right. So do you think that could also border that sort of, you know, both pejorative, you know, condescending, but also intimate and familiar?
Yeah, I want to pull up my,
you had a slide, right?
Yeah, a slide on that. My presentation got closed out and I'm trying to find it again. So forgive me.
I love the infographics, the 언니 오빠 infographic. I'm gonna have to steal it for every Korean lecture.
Oh yeah, I feel free. I mean, it's like janky emoji.
Oh, I love it.
But I'm glad you enjoyed it. I am pulling it up. Meter is being slow, but yeah, I actually have another thing that I wanted to talk about with Day. What I find hilarious and heartwarming is that if I just explain the singular they to Koreans as a grammatical concept, they love it. They're like so down with it because the singular they just exists, you know, as a concept in Korean. So that's sort of the approach that I take nowadays, like in relation to my own gender identity. If I'm just like, oh, you know, we have ku in Korean, they're like, oh yeah. Instead of like, yeah, it's sort of, I mean, it is like a survival tactic for me, right, to sort of introduce myself in that roundabout way. But I found that people are quite excited to learn that English, you know, we have another option beyond he and she.
Right. And that this is a discussion and there's room for change.
Yeah, for sure. And Jihad, the Korean performance artist that I mentioned in my Unni essay at the end, she has another essay. I just remembered it this morning, where she's like, you know, I'm widely paraphrasing her, but she's like, I can't believe I was colonized by the English language into dividing everyone into he and she. And like now all my queer Korean American friends are looking down on me for like not catching up with the times. Like, I can't believe you guys colonized me and then like leapt into liberation all by yourselves. So
Right.
there's like sort of this, I guess, sort of delay in how queer language is transmuted. So it's been an interesting conversation in Korean.
Yeah, I would imagine. And so,
Yeah.
I mean, it's clear to me that you're in conversation with not just this particular book of poetry, but with feminist poetry, with feminist discussions, popular discourse, broader. Like, can you share a little bit about how you came across this particular poet, this book, this project? When, I mean, you can't possibly translate everything you find interesting. So when does it become the next year of your life?
I wish it was a year. I translated this so quickly. I had like
Oh,
two
really?
very tight deadlines. I translated this in about 2.5 months.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then I promptly fell ill. So I do not recommend it. But like I said in the beginning, I read a lot of interesting things, but some things really stand out in the sort of pile of books that I have. And I think about like what would be most interesting to read in a slightly different context, right? And Catcalling definitely was that for me. Not only the visuality of these poems, but it's so Korean in this way. Soho herself, like one of the first times I met her, she's like, I'm so Korean. I'm like from the Joseon dynasty.
What does she mean by that, you think?
Well, it's definitely sort of a millennial Korean thing to be self-deprecating, like, oh, like I'm so behind and like backwards and I'm from the Joseon dynasty. So it's like very Korean humor. But if you read through this collection, there are a lot of very specific Korean references to Tesa, to specific places in Seoul, across Korea, in a way that my first poetry collection, Unexpected Vanilla, like is completely not in that way. So I like finding projects that even contradict each other in what they're trying to say about Koreanness, because Korean poets aren't trying to represent Korea in the way that diasporic poets often feel the need to.
Right.
But I like how sort of my own body of works become a very complex tapestry of Koreanness. So I like how I get to sort of share that aspect.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing somewhere that you identify as 1.5. You're Korean American in the background, right? Did you grow up in the States?
I immigrated when I was 7, so a little bit
Okay.
younger than you when I moved over. But yes, my citizenship is the U.S. So
I wasn't asking about your citizenship status,
yeah.
but
Yeah.
no, but the gaze of just looking to Korea for Koreanness, or Korean, like diasporic Koreans looking for signs of things that represent Koreanness. I think that's also an interesting comment in this context, especially because this work, Iso, is so irreverent. It's like it is just so just graphic and perverse and violent, and despite what she might say about herself, also just just deeply and intrinsically in some ways anti-traditional. There's something just unruly, just unkempt about her whole way of narrating and and describing her experiences and her relationships. Did you struggle with any of that? Like, was it did at any point during those months that you spent intimate time with the poems, did you think this is just too much?
I mean, I lost my mind. without mincing words. I mean, because it was such an intense translating period, like I was really just living and breathing this collection, right? And it did get very overwhelming, but I think that level of intensity also helped me because I was so in it that I was sort of like, I have to sort of process all of this violent language through my own body and make it convincing. So it was overwhelming. But I'm glad it's out.
Yeah. And do you
Yeah.
think you struggled with maybe striking a balance between what is graphic in one language with the same level of graphicness or impact in the other language? I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, probably later on, I'm going to have to ask you, why are you translating poetry? Like for someone who doesn't translate poetry, I cannot imagine a more difficult task. This is incredible to me that you even do this, but that's for later. The
that's
balance.
for my own masochism to be questioned. Yeah.
I don't know. There's something incredibly creative about this process. But yeah, but what about that balance between what is, what remains ambivalent, what remains graphic on the one hand? How do you translate that into the other?
Well, you read Korean also, so I kind of want to flip the question back to you and ask you, did you feel that the impact was equal or at least similar in across the two versions?
I think they vary. Yeah, with some poems, I think they were more impactful. I don't usually use that word, but in English, and and then sometimes it's just so perverse in Korean, but in English, meh. Like, I mean,
really?
Like the word "you." I mean, I think for me, like I'm sort of old school that way, for like the idea that someone, for instance, would talk to their parents and use "diga" or "diga 뭔데," or like, I mean, even the 언니 who's a year older, there's a transgression that's involved in even those small acts of linguistic confrontation.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. And now that I know that you're the firstborn in your family, I'm sure it felt like extra.
How dare you?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
I mean, so it's not just cuss words, right? And it's not just throwing around words like bitch and fuck. Like, it's not just about that. There's so much built into the structures of translation. Yeah. So how do you do it? What are
well, if I sort of provoke the meh response to the you, I feel like maybe I failed Judy in some way.
No, that's not what I mean. Meh isn't the difference. I thought the difference was like sometimes greater than others. Sometimes they were like right on par, and then sometimes it's just like different.
No, tipping. I'm just kidding. But I think my intention is always to sort of keep them level, and like you pointed out, sometimes the cultural context is just too big for me to achieve that in just one line. And of course there are certain footnotes throughout this collection that sort of contextualizes certain things for the reader, but with the you, I felt like it would be too extra for me to like go in there with a footnote and say, this is like such an insulting term.
right. No, that's definitely don't do that. I mean, and I think the reason I keep bringing that up is because I'm just confronted with this realization that there is no one-to-one replication, transference of meaning in translation. And I think that's what I was so struck by your work with Chogwa. The idea that multiple translators can translate the same poem in multiple ways, and for that to be okay. You know what I mean? That this wasn't about a competition, like to win the best translation, that this wasn't to try to get at the most authentic or truthful or faithful meaning. I thought that was just so brilliant.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up Choga. I had no idea you would also look into that. Yeah, I mean, I was in a translation program where it was very much of the like, we must get to the essence of the source text. But then after a while, especially while doing poetry, you realize like the Korean is written ambiguously, and it's meant to be read that way. And there are multiple interpretations, even in untranslated works. You know, I think we turn to poetry because it is so nuanced and ambiguous and mysterious and multivalent. And so I decided to start this project where we could sort of freely pursue all of these different directions without canceling each other out. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. Do you see a lot of growth potential? Do you see a lot of interest in translating poetry?
I definitely, yeah. Our last issue, we had 12 different translations of one poem. So it's, yeah, steadily growing
Yeah.
as the project goes on.
I mean, it's interesting because I'm probably more likely to do a translation project of declarations and manifestos and, you know, press conference statements, which are,
right.
of course, a different genre. But in some ways, they're the kinds of nuances and cultural contexts that one deals with in any genre. I would imagine challenges exist across the board. What do you think are some of your biggest challenges in translating not just poetry, but poetry with a lot of political teeth, a lot of political currency, and also just kind of in the spotlight?
Yeah, I want to deliver the emotional impact of that the source had on me. So I sort of want to replicate my experience of reading the poem, and sometimes it involves reorganizing footnotes, you know, changing words from, you know, null to your name or something like that. So yeah, I do. I also translate non-poetry and non-literature. I do some technical translation as well. So I can sort of contrast that personally between the different projects that I do. And speaking of manifestos and manuals, I saw on your calendar for feminist politics, you have an upcoming event with Hae-jin Shim from Survived and Punished. And I actually this was my only project that I've done from English into Korean, so the opposite way for me. And I translated sort of a manual for queer survivors of domestic abuse.
No way, cool. That the project. Oh, you did that.
Yeah. Oh, did you read? Yeah.
I read it, and
Caseta?
I've attended their workshops. And
yeah. So when I saw that, I was like, wow, what a small world.
It is a small world.
I've never met Hae-jin in person. We just became Twitter friends, and then I ended up doing this gig for them. So even with that project, I definitely use the terminology, like sort of the, you know, the casual vocab slang of the queer community here. So I try to, like, in addition to paying close attention to the text itself, I try to just be mindful and curious about things that are happening right now around me.
Right. It seems like that's also advice you could give to aspiring translators, that you don't just study translation.
Yeah, I read, I mean, nowadays less so, but back when I lived in the States, actually, right now I brought up my citizenship because I have this sort of dual immigrant status of, like, I'm a Korean American back in Korea.
Right.
But back when I lived in the States, when I was attending UC Berkeley as an undergrad, I had a Twitter account where I would just follow people. I didn't tweet out anything, but I just followed a bunch of queer Korean activists and just like people. And that's sort of how I picked up a lot of queer terminologies that are being used, you know, outside of academia or, you know, in everyday contexts. So that kind of knowledge definitely paid off once I got here.
Right. And
I knew what people were talking about.
Yeah, no, for sure. And among feminists too, the kind of activist jargon or slang, the colloquial language that also appears in, like, throughout this poetry collection too. You must have to make some decisions on how to match that to perhaps what is current in English. Do you have an example of that in this collection, you think?
Oh, I don't No.
I mean, because like
Everything-
catcalling is not exactly one of
Mm.
those terms, but that is
Yeah.
certainly an equivalent in both.
No, that's such a good example. Oh, my screen sharing disappeared. I was gonna get to the che.
Oh, eventually. Oh, sorry.
Eventually. No. Why are you please don't apologize. I should have gotten to that. But what were we talking about? Catcalling. So the Korean title is Catcalling.
Yeah.
It's a transliteration of the English into Hangul. And I actually almost changed the title in English translation because catcalling is less of like it is the term that's used in Korea by people who are already aware of the phenomenon, but catcalling is less a thing in Korea as a form of, you know, street harassment. Am I going to go into this? I mean, the sex crimes here are more digital based. I'm sure you've been reading the news.
Yeah, all the murka and all
hidden
that.
cameras in
Yeah.
like public restrooms. And I don't know to what extent I should be explaining this for our audience here watching. Should I?
Sure. I mean, especially because
Yeah.
it's such a concern.
Yeah, and Lee Soho actually in her next collection that hasn't been published yet, she sent me her manuscript, and it has, because you know she engages in visual poetry, one of her next poems is a picture of a bathroom stall with tiny holes drilled into the stall, and then she has a footnote where she sort of like that's the poem. And so to give context to what's happening is cis men are entering women's bathrooms and drilling holes, tiny holes, into the stall to install tiny cameras where they either like live stream women going to the restroom or like taking pictures. And it's so perverse, but it's so prevalent. It's like it's become one of the most prevalent sex crimes in Korea. And it's such a violation of women's privacy, and also it's meant to humiliate, you know, like the sort of psychology that the psychological reasoning that articles have presented is like, oh, they feel so disempowered by women's empowerment that they have to watch women at their lowest to feel better about themselves. So it's this whole thing. And if you go to like a subway, like a metro restroom, like you will find these tiny holes, and it's frightening, you know. It's like you don't know where it's like you don't know which of these holes has been
I've seen people carry little kits with stickers.
Right.
So when you enter
there's
those
like
stalls,
that whole mark. Yeah, it's I feel so frustrated about the world because now there's a market for anti-morka, you know, hidden camera technology, and so women have to pay money to be safe against these cameras. But I went on a sort of a tangent. So my point is catcalling as a concept is less familiar in Korea because the men are less confrontational to sex crimes are hidden. And so I was thinking, because catcalling when translated literally into English, like everyone knows what catcalling is in English, so I was like, well, you know, it's not gonna have that same sense of foreignness. So I was going so I was just going to pick out like some of my favorite phrases from different poems. Like one of the options was playing with scars, which is from a poem in the 5th section, because you know Isol, like what is she doing if not playing with her own scars? But ultimately I was vetoed by the publisher. So we went with catcalling. But yeah,
that's such an interesting point too, because catcalling is a kind of violence that puts on display in a public context. It's about being subjected to harassment and violence in public, where others might be present. But whether it's about the kind of digital sex crimes you're talking about, or the kind of intimate family violence, and even violence among sisters, and obviously with Oppa, like, I mean, all the all those kinds of forms of violence in one's proximity, that's not covered by a focus on catcalling per se.
Yeah, and I
Yeah,
want
that's
to
interesting.
mention that Lee Soho herself, I asked her at one point, because while I was like, oh, like maybe it just doesn't carry the same valence. So I asked her, well, how would you feel about changing the title? And she was very open. She really liked playing with scars, which was very validating. And she told me she picked catcalling not because she felt like it was the because there's a poem called Catcalling, and she picked it as a title not because she felt like that poem in particular was representative of the whole collection, but she just felt like it was catchy. Catcalling as a word is catchy because to Koreans it's less of a violent, it carries less of a violent connotation. They're like,
Sure.
like it sounds cute. And that's also the critique that we have in English, that it's such it doesn't do the harassment justice in terms of how it sort of neutralizes the actual fear that people encounter.
Right. No, that's such an interesting. So you had the executive decisions along the way to make some decisions, but not all. The author herself didn't have all the decision-making power either, it sounds like.
Yeah. I mean, I tried because she's alive and very online. I emailed her a lot about different thoughts that I was having. I contacted her less to be like, oh, is this the right one? But I would sort of give her different options. Like, I floated different titles, like Playing with Scars, or I don't know what else I forget, but I gave her like 5 different things, and I'm like, oh, this is sort of, and then I would translate them back into Korean to sort of convey the meaning. And so she would be like, oh, I like this, and I would do that with the poems themselves too, like he who rides and every man who has ridden and written me, that poem, with getting the sort of the rhyme. I gave her like 8 different options. I was like, these are all the different ways we can sort of recreate the synda, which is a homonym, right, for to write and also to use. So I would always give her all of these options, and then she would give me her thoughts. She'd be like, oh, I like this, but then sometimes, like a lot of the times, I would be in agreement with her, but sometimes I would not agree with her. And I would sort of go with
was there any moment in this collection that you thought this poem meant this, and then you talked to her and you were off in your interpretation?
Yeah, speaking of speakers, when it's not specified, not spelled out in the Korean, I workshop some of these poems with translators who happen to be Korean nationals, and they would disagree with each other. And then it would like like one person would correct me, and then I would ask another person to make sure, and then they'll be like, no, you were right. So I'm like, oh my god, like this is
no authority.
This speaks to the difficulty, but also it validates my confusion. And then ultimately I would ask Lee Soho, like I try to not ask her about like subject stuff because it just seems so basic. But
it's so important, and it can completely change things.
Yeah, and I didn't realize, like sometimes I'm like, well, of course it's I, and then someone will be like, no, it's you, and then Lee Soho will be like, no, it's I, and I'm like, yes, I got it. So there were maybe 2 instances where like the subject was different from what I assumed. Nami is back.
I think we do have to transition to Q&A, but like
right.
There's actually a question that's sort of related to this about translating and the nuances. SJA had a question
Uh-huh.
about there's some words in Korean that has more nuance, right? Like 바득 바득 or 시칼. And so how when this gets translated into crunch crunch or simply knife, from shikal to knife, it seems like, you know, that's the kind of nuance that one struggles with. Do you remember struggling or I don't know, did you spend any time poring over this word choice, knife?
Knife, I think in terms of rhythm, I didn't want to go with cooking knife, you know? Because sometimes
Kitchen knife,
yeah,
cleaver,
kitchen,
there are all
yeah.
kinds of, yeah, sure.
Yeah, because or like fruit knife because it's a you're cutting an apple. But my thinking is that sometimes translators will get so specific to, you know, get at every nuance of the word that it bogs down the poem itself. And then, you know, readers might be like, of course it's a kitchen knife,
Right.
you know. So I went with knife. As for 바득 바득, that was definitely something that I poured over because, you know, Korean has all this onomatopoeia like 이태일 이성어 that don't exist in English or are less developed in English. So everyone knows Dami Choi, the brilliant poet translator. In her translations of Kim Il-sung, she would often double verbs in that same way. So I took a page from Dami and double
interesting.
crunch, crunch.
So that's a strategy. Yeah.
Yeah.
What other strategies do you have for folks who say, you know, there are just some words in Korean that just don't exist in English, even in, you know, the idea? You know, it's usually things like, you know, like let's not get into Han or Jong or things like that, but 고소하다 or, you know, 개운하다, or like, I mean, these words that people often bring up as examples of the kind of Koreanness that we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
Well, because it's poetry, I also invite people to make up their own words, you know? Crunch crunch is not a word that you can find in the English language. So you sort of Frankenstein these different languages together to find something coherent, I think.
Yeah. That's brilliant. Nami, should I let you ask a question? I use my executive privilege.
No, actually, the conversation was so thought-provoking, but also so much fun that I didn't want it to disrupt you. I wish we can spend more time just talking. There are two questions, however, from the audience. So should we go ahead? Should I go ahead and read those questions?
Sure. They're actually by the same person, it looks like.
Yes, well, actually two from Ashley Kim, but let's go ahead with the first one. I feel that the majority conservative Korean media constantly gaslights feminists. Do people who are part of the Korean feminist literature community see translation as an escape from that hypersensitive online mob society?
Like, could the English translation possibly offer a way out of this, you know, kind of closed chamber? Interesting.
That's interesting. I haven't thought of it that way. I because I'm facing a different audience, right? The Korean feminists, I mean, catcalling is sold in Korea as well, but you know, I wrote this with people living elsewhere. So I don't know if I can offer them an escape, but I would love it if it did give them any sort of solace. Yeah,
or validation from elsewhere that then becomes legitimacy when returned
like
to Korea.
This sort of poetry is taken seriously enough to be published elsewhere. Yeah, I definitely get that sense from Lee Soho herself. She was telling me I think a lot of people would be surprised to find that she lives with her parents still. Yeah, despite all
Not
the
her
drama
sister.
that, her sister lives in Australia with her boyfriend, which is why. Okay, anyway, I'm not gonna go into that whole thing, but she lives with her parents, and she told me, she's like, "Thank you for translating this collection, because now that my book is available in the U.S., my parents finally respect me."
Interesting.
Her parents are like, oh, like she's actually doing something with her life, that kind of thing. So I guess I've helped one person.
You had a hand in holding up this.
Yeah. Her parents are sort of just, like they didn't expect this, right? When their daughter became a poet. So.
I guess there's another question from S. Lee. I'm curious what the experience was of being edited by someone who's not familiar with Korean, which I presume was the case, though I'm not certain. Was there significant input from the publisher aside from design aspects?
Yeah, Anastasia Nicholas at Open Letter Books, my poetry editor, is wonderful. She had read a lot of Korean feminist poetry in translation by Tommy Choi, Emily Chung Min Yoon, all these people who have come before me. And so Anastasia was actually quite, I feel like, I mean, she might deny this, but I think she was pretty knowledgeable in Korean poetry in translation. And then so she could sort of see how catcalling fit into the existing canon, I guess, in translation. But on like a word to word level, no, she couldn't read the Korean. So it was up to me to explain to her, there's this homonym in Korean that I'm struggling to deal with. So I would sort of spell it out for her, and then we would have these conversations. And she was really, really great in terms of like being my sounding board in terms of like, oh, this cultural context, like you need to spell this out a little bit more. So yeah, I found it to be a good experience.
This also confirms the rumor that translation is not an isolated experience, that you engage certainly with the author, the editors, the world, your parents.
Yeah, my parents. Oh God. the distant Oppa,
yeah, and
banished from my life. Yeah.
Well, and also I noticed a pattern in a lot of the translators of poetry that they are poets themselves. Are you a poet yourself?
I feel embarrassed because I haven't really been actively publishing them, but yeah, I started as a writer, and hope to pursue my own poetry as well.
Yeah, excellent. Really looking forward to seeing more work. I feel like we should call on Victoria, who was the mastermind behind this amazing conversation.
Right, let's do that. But let me just go ahead and read one more question from Ashley Kim. The theme of vengeance has a different register in Korean culture and therefore Korean art forms. I feel that that's just so perfect for feminist art, but a different part of me feels that it can also be limiting. How do you see vengeance playing out in the literature you translate? And have you ever faced difficulties in communicating that intense form of anger to the English-speaking reader?
Ooh. Yeah, now that you sort of position catcalling in the over of, Park Chan-wook, Vengeance trilogy. Wow. Yeah, let me think about this. What a great question.
And I think it's also vengeance in the form of a certain violence or the expression of rage, right?
Yeah. I think it's slightly different because we now are receiving it from an entirely female feminist perspective. Park Chan-wook is male. Of course, he has Lady Vengeance as well with Lee Young-ae, which is great. But to have a woman sort of penning all of these revenge and violence, literary violence, it's sort of novel.
Victoria.
Thank you for inviting me to ask questions as well.
Yeah.
I suppose Soje touched on this earlier in the discussion, but in selecting texts to form what essentially will become the English canon of Soje the translator. What do you what do you think you're potentially looking for in the future? We have your collection of Lee Hyemi's poems, which are more queer, romantic poetry, perhaps sensual, erotic poetry.
You do this
And
with
we have-
sensual.
we have the upcoming To the Warm Horizon, which is
Yeah.
a somewhat sci-fi, futuristic, apocalyptic novel.
Lesbians in the apocalypse.
Wow.
Exactly.
This is
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah. I mean, I guess sort of tying back into the previous question about vengeance, like this is the only work that I've translated that deals with vengeance or violence. Like everything else is very not this energy.
So you won't be
yeah.
typecast as the translator of
Yeah,
vengeance.
I'm not typecast. Yeah, I do really think about translators as sort of actors as well. Like I've talked about method translating before. Yeah. Yeah. But Victoria, I cut you off. Did you have like a question?
No, that was the question of just what are you looking forward perhaps to adding to our English canon of Korean literature? Because it's really with translators such as yourself and Anton Her and our other Smoking Tiger friends, Sophie Bowman, Song Yu, just fantastic young generation of translators who are broadening what we can see now as Korean literature in English. So what are you looking
really
to contribute?
Yeah, because the first sort of Anton and I have had a discussion about this, and we sort of disagree on how we define the generations of Korean translators. But I feel like I'm sort of in the 3.5. Like you and I are in the 3.5. Like I always feel sort of in between.
Third and fourth generations.
Yeah. But he thinks that we're still in the third or even second. But anyway, yeah, it's like a whole thing. Maybe he and I will do a talk later on this. But the first generation of Korean translators, I want everyone to know that a lot of these were white men who came to Korea as missionaries or like UN people, so they were sort of approaching Korea as outsiders, and then they went on to become academics. So they had an interest in replicating the Korean canon in translation, right? A lot of male authors, right? But then whatever generation we're in now, everyone is sort of looking at different things. Like we have Kwajŏng, who's doing the very canonical thing, but he's sort of in the minority now for pursuing colonial poets. And then we have a lot of members of Smoking Tigers doing really, really cutting edge sci-fi stuff, which hadn't been translated that much previous to this decade, I would say. So it's really exciting.
Interesting.
As for me, because someone like Sophie Bowman, she talked about her like growing up with sci-fi and her long interest in sci-fi. Like I have no desire to compete with a true sci-fi fan. I think it's great that we all have our sort of niches and passions. So mine I guess is like queer stuff. Queer stuff. Hopefully I've been noticing more non-binary poets as well, so that would be interesting to translate. But right now my the next project that I've decided on, I hope I can talk about it. I don't see why not. Is a novel by Serang Chang, who is the author of the School Nurse Files. I don't know if people have seen the Netflix show.
Yep.
Have people? Yeah.
Yep.
So
she's
she's someone who definitely is like like I like to use the word shimmies. She shimmies between these the very literary fiction and sort of wacky sci-fi world. And she has a novel called 시선으로부터 that was a bestseller last year. It was picked as like the #1 book of 2020, and that is about a family who celebrates their mother/grandmother's Chesa 10th anniversary Chesa in Hawaii. So it's about how a family subverts the traditional expectations of mourning ceremonies, you know, ancestral rites, by going to Hawaii and sort of thinking about lineage in a new way. I'm not doing a great job explaining this right now. It is still early in the morning for me. But,
now you blame the time.
yeah, now I blame the time. But it's not just some like empty, like, oh, they go on an island vacation. Like they go to Hawaii and then realize that they're part of the problem in, you know, how tourism affects the environment. Jeong is like a staunch environmentalist, so she thinks about how she thinks about ecologism. She thinks about indigenous sovereignty. Like there's like a chapter dedicated to like the indigenous people of Hawaii. So yeah, it's a really interesting book in terms of how she uses the Chesa as like a plot point, but then the Chesa is like totally different from what we expect a Korean Chesa to look like.
No, that's so interesting, especially in an indigenous context, and the conjuring of ancestors. I can see this being an amazing connection. So what I'm hearing is that you don't care much about the sort of the generational genealogy, like in the selection process. Do you feel pressure too? Like, I mean, does anybody tell you like, you can't do this, you have to do this first?
Oh, I feel like that was more of an issue when I was in school, maybe, but then now I'm a freelancer, so I'm so I mean, for better or worse, I'm so disconnected from those people. So yeah, I have fewer naysayers. Yeah, I guess what I'm hearing for myself is I like to translate different authors who redefine Koreanness.
Oh, this is so exciting. I'm just so I'm going to be thinking about this for a very long time. It's one of the most eye-opening and enjoyable conversations, experiences this whole year.
Yeah, it was so nice to meet you and talk about Annie and everything.
Oh, and there's so much more.
Yes.
I can only concur with what just Judy said, and we're going to have you back sometime very soon.
Oh, I would love to.
In person, hopefully.
Yes, in person, definitely. And to continue to talk about all the just very thought-provoking subjects that we've covered so far. We are hoping, the Center for Korean Studies is hoping to continue with these series of Kwajong, and with the, obviously, the help of Victoria and all other people. Sometime in the fall will be our third event of this series. So I'd like to thank you, Soje, Judy, and Victoria, all so very much for this wonderful event, and such a fun event. Actually, it's one of the few times it was so fun to be part of.
On Zoom.
Yeah, on Zoom, yes. So thank you so very much once again. And for those of you whose questions have not been answered, I am sorry about that. Perhaps Soje will be open to getting questions in person sometime
Yeah.
after the event.
Do you have a website? Actually, there was a question
Yeah.
about sharing your work.
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
oh, yeah, I saw that too from Julie Kim. I
Mhm.
haven't posted my poetry. They live on very private Google Docs
Okay.
at the moment.
All right.
So what's the
But I
URL
do
again?
have but I do have a website. It's smokingtigers.com/soje, I think.
Mhm.
And then I have Twitter at Soje Flux,
Wonderful.
FLUX. So you can probably DM me your questions if they're urgent.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria.
And thank you so much once again, all three of you. We would probably have to end our event today. And for those of you, again, who would like to look up the website of the Center for Korean Studies for future events, and also possibly donate to our fundraising so that we will be able to continue with this kind of program in the future. Please go take a look at this John Duncan Fellowship in Korean Studies. John Duncan is the former director of the Center for Korean Studies. So once again, thank you and good night.
Night. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.